Hello everyone, today's lesson is about photosynthesis and respiration. Let's review with ATP. ATP is that energy currency molecule that we needed to do active transport if we need to move something against the concentration gradient, if we need to force something somewhere, we needed ATP to do that. ATP is what we're going to process our food through respiration to make. We all have energy needs for our body. We're going to process chemical energy into this ATP through our body's metabolism. We're going to need it to grow, to reproduce, to do that active transport, to move, and to make heat to maintain our nice constant temperature in our bodies. Now, depending on what kind of organism you are, if you're an autotroph, you can create the chemical energy needed in order to make ATP. Or if you're a heterotroph, you might need to eat those chemical energies that you're consuming in order to make this ATP. But all organisms use chemical energy. All organisms are going to turn organic compounds like carbohydrates into ATP to do cell processes. So we're going to analyze photosynthesis and cellular respiration in terms of how these kinds of energy can be stored, released, transferred within and between the systems. So we'll start with respiration, compare the different types of respiration and the products that they make, and then we'll look at photosynthesis and the formula and connections between respiration. Now, the kind of respiration we're talking about here is cellular respiration, not the kind of breathing that you would think about, but that breathing is important because it takes in oxygen. You're going to combine it with the sugars that you get from your digestive system in your food, and that oxygen and sugar will go into your cells. Your mitochondria will use those ingredients to make ATP through cellular respiration. The whole process of how that happens is pretty complicated, but thankfully, all we really need to know is the basic formula, and we can combine that with combustion, something you're familiar with. So combustion uses fuel, it uses oxygen to make heat and light in this chemical reaction, and carbon dioxide and water are byproducts of that. Now, aerobic respiration that we're going to talk about first, it's very similar. It uses fuel, it uses oxygen. The fuel in this case is your food. The oxygen comes from your breathing. The products we make here are going to be ATP. Product is that chemical currency that you're trying to make in your cells. And we breathe out carbon dioxide and water because those are the waste products of that. So it's like little fires happening in your body all the time. So this is how the formula looks. We've got our reactants on the left. Those are the things that go into the reaction. And the products on the right, these are the things that come out of the reaction. You need glucose and oxygen to react to make carbon dioxide and water. And through that process, we're producing 36 ATP. And this is what is happening in your mitochondria. Now, lots happening in this reaction. There's lots of enzymes involved and in between molecules that get used or change or help. But this is the simplified version. Glucose goes in, oxygen goes in, carbon dioxide, water, and ATP come out. So anaerobic respiration is going to be a little different. Anaerobic respiration is when there is no oxygen to use or it just doesn't use it. So you don't need mitochondria to do this, so it happens in the cytoplasm. And without oxygen, we're only making 2 ATP here. There's not as much energy being made. Sometimes we call this fermentation. Lactic acid fermentation is when we would create lactic acid as a product. This happens in bacteria and animals. It's how we make pickles and yogurt. It's what causes muscle cramps when you're exercising and your muscle cells start to run low on oxygen. Yeast can do anaerobic respiration as well, but they do alcoholic fermentation. So when you take away the oxygen from yeast, they will resort to this and create alcohol instead. Even though they have mitochondria, without oxygen, they'll have to do this instead. So lactic acid fermentation looks like this. Again, it's a type of anaerobic respiration, so there's no oxygen in your reactants. Your only reactant here is glucose. And in the cytoplasm, we'll turn that into carbon dioxide and lactic acid and make 2 ATP in that process. That'll be enough energy to get some necessary stuff done, but it won't be enough energy to support a very large, complex organism. Alcohol fermentation is what yeast will do. There's yeast that live on the skin of these grapes, so we can put them in a large container with water, and by sealing off the oxygen, they will resort to having to do this. So they'll take the sugars from the grapes and they'll turn it into carbon dioxide and alcohol in order to make 2 ATP for them to survive. So to compare the two, aerobic needs the oxygen and the glucose. Anaerobic only needs the glucose, does not need oxygen. Aerobic happens in mitochondria. That's what they do. Anaerobic happens in the cytoplasm. Aerobic respiration produces carbon dioxide and water as waste products in order to make these 36 ATP. Anaerobic respiration only makes 2 ATP and produces carbon dioxide, and instead of water, it will make lactic acid if it's a bacteria or an animal cell, and if it's a yeast cell, it will make alcohol. So we call this fermentation. Aerobic respiration, it makes more energy, so that more energy supports large complex organisms. The anaerobic respiration makes less energy, so it cannot support consistently for large organisms, only small organisms, but large organisms can use it as a backup. Now, if you can make your own glucose, then you don't have to eat that glucose, and you can make the ATP from the glucose that you've already made. So this is what plants do. Plants have chloroplast organelles that have lots of chlorophyll. Chlorophyll is a green pigment protein that helps them absorb solar energy. So by taking in carbon dioxide and water from their environment, they can make the glucose that can then be processed in respiration to make ATP. So they're making the food so that they can make ATP for their cells. And a byproduct of this is oxygen, so they can make plenty of oxygen in this process that they can use and that we can use as well. So they take in the carbon dioxide through their leaves, they take in the water through their roots, and in their leaves, they're going to use sunlight to transform those two ingredients into sugars, into carbohydrates, and produce lots of oxygen as a byproduct of that. So our reactants are carbon dioxide and water, and through using light, we can combine it to make sugar and make oxygen. So that sugar and that oxygen that we make in photosynthesis can then be used as the reactants in respiration. And this respiration produces the ATP that can then be used to divide cells and do active transport and all kinds of other things. So these reactions are basically the same, just backwards. The reactants of one are going to be the products of the other. The reactants of respiration are the products of photosynthesis, and the reactants of photosynthesis are the products of respiration. So because of this, we can make a nice cycle. Producers who are making the sugars and the oxygen, they can make the ingredients that are needed for respiration, and then the products of respiration can then be used again in photosynthesis. They can go around and around and around. Plants can use their own sugars and oxygen to make ATP in respiration, and then take back in that carbon dioxide and water to keep going and keep doing that. Or that sugar and oxygen can go to heterotrophs, to consumers. They can take that stuff in to their mitochondria and produce ATP that way. But when they breathe out that carbon dioxide and produce that water, that can go back to the plants to do photosynthesis. On an ecological level, this can happen at a very large scale with lots of CO2 in the atmosphere being pulled in through photosynthesis, being released through respiration. We've got lots of carbon that goes into the ground from dead organisms, and more recently, lots of carbon being dug up out of the ground from those fossil fuels and being burned and put into the atmosphere. All this carbon dioxide in the atmosphere has been noticed over the past couple hundred years. We have seasonal fluctuations of more photosynthesis in summer when you have more leaves, and less photosynthesis in winter when there are less leaves. So even though we have seasonal variations, that general trend is showing way more carbon dioxide, which is contributing to the recent climate change. So to sum up, we've got the respiration, two different formulas there with products produced in each. Big differences in ATP because one uses oxygen and the other doesn't. And then we have photosynthesis. We've got plants and other organisms that can create their own sugars to use in respiration, and a cycle that can support itself in all kinds of ecosystems. And I hope that was helpful.